So this is our third video of the week. It's our final video on Chapter 10, Part 1, and there's a review assignment that follows this. So first thing we'll do is just review graphing. This has an amp of 3. This is your A number. This is your B number. The period for the cos is 2 pi divided by B. So it'll be 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. Then you have to always get your critical numbers, and the way you do that is you take the period and you divide by 4, because there's 5 critical numbers. And 0 is the first one, unless you have a phase shift. So it's pi over 2 divided by 4, which is pi over 2. This line, you have to flip the 4 upside down. It's pi over 8. So my critical numbers are adding pi over 8. So I'm going to start at 0. Then I'm going to go to pi over 8, and 1/8 plus 1/8 is 2/8, which is pi over 1/4. 2/8 plus 1/8 is 3/8, and 3/8 plus 1/8 is 4/8, which is 1/2. And you could do that on your calculator. So we have a cos graph amp 3. So cos always starts at its amp, then it goes to the axis, then it goes down, then it goes to the axis, and then it goes up. And there's your cos graph amp 3, period pi over 2. This equation has an amp of -5, so it's a reverse sine graph. And this is the same as 1/2 theta. So your period is 2 pi divided by b, which is 1/2, which should be 2 pi times 2 over 1, which is 4 pi. So you get your critical numbers by taking the period and dividing by 4. So pi is what you're going to add every time. So I'm going to start at 0, 1 pi, add another pi, it'd be at 2 pi, add another pi, it'd be at 3 pi, add another pi, it'd be at 4 pi. And I'm at a reverse graph amp 5 for the sine. Sine starts at the axis, usually goes up, but then, because it's a reverse graph, it go down, then it goes to the axis, then it would go up, and then it would go back to the axis. So then we're going to look at a tan graph. Remember, tan is different. Tan uses the y-axis for its center and does 2 critical numbers on either side. So my amp is -5, so it's a reverse tan graph. The period formula for the tan is different than the sine and the cos. It's just pi divided by b, and b here is 2 pi. So it'd be pi divided by 2 pi, so that would just be 1/2. So your critical numbers would be 1/2 divided by 4, which is 1/2 times 1/4, because you have to flip the 4 upside down, and you get 1/8. So remember, this is the center for the tan, unless you have a phase shift. And I would go 2 critical numbers on this side, 1/8, and 1/8 plus 1/8 is 2/8, which is 1/4. And then I'd go 1/8 this way, and then -1/4 that way. And those are asymptotes, and you have to put your asymptotes in your graph, and your 0 in the middle. And then it's a reverse amp 5. Normally tan goes up. In the middle here, it's going to go down. And remember, it's a curve. And here, you're like that. It's just really steep. But it's a curve. It's not a line. So the tan is different than the sine and the cos. Its period formula is pi divided by b, and it does 2 critical numbers on either side of the center. So now if we start doing some shifts, here my amp is 4. This is your A. This is my B. So cos period is 2 pi divided by B. This is your phase shift. It says to subtract pi over 4 from the x, which means you're going to go right pi over 4. And this is your vertical shift. You're adding 2, so you're going to go up 2. So I always take my graph and I put my vertical axis first. So this is the axis I'm going to graph on. And then I'm going to, the sine and the cos, this is where they start at, their phase shift. So we're going to start right pi over 4. Then we're going to get our critical numbers. Our critical numbers, you always take the period and divide by 4, which is pi divided by 4. So I'm simply going to add this every time to my starting point, which is pi over 4. So if I add that, I'm going to go 1/4 plus 1/4 is 2/4, which is a half. 2/4 plus 1/4 is 3/4. 3/4 plus 1/4 is 4/4, which is 1. And 4/4 plus 1/4 are 5/4. So those are your critical numbers. And now we're going to graph a sine graph. I'll do it in green. Actually, we're doing a cos graph, reverse amp 4. So cos always goes to its amp, except this time it's reverse. So at pi over 4, from the blue axis, you're going to go down 4. Oh, sorry, it's not a reverse amp. It's a regular 4. Sorry. So at pi over 4, I'm going to go up 4. Then I'm going to go to the axis. Then I'm going to go down 4. Then I'm going to go to the axis. And then I'm going up 4. So there is my cos graph. So then we're going to look at a sine graph. My amp here is -3, so it's going to be a reverse sine graph. That's your A. This is my B. The period for the tan, sine and cos is 2 pi divided by B, which would be 2 pi, flip 1/2 upside down, which is 4 pi. It says to add pi, so I'm going to go left pi. And then my vertical shift is down 3. So I'm going to have a new axis down 3. So I'm going to graph down 3. And my my phase shift is, and remember, sine and cos, this is where you start. So I'm going to start at -pi. And then I'm going to get my critical numbers. My critical numbers, you take your period and you divide by 4. So the critical number is pi. So I'm going to take -1 pi and add pi. I'd be at 0. And then I'd 0 and 1 pi, I'm at pi. 1 pi and I'd add pi, I get to 2 pi. And 2 pi plus 1 pi is 3 pi. And now I'm going to do a sine graph on that red axis, which is at -3, and it's reverse amp 3. So that means I'm going to go down 3 and up 3 and graph a sine graph. So if I graph a sine graph starting at -pi, sine starts on the axis, then it usually goes up, but this one's going to go down. Then it goes to the axis, then it's going to go up, and then it's going to go back to the axis. So there's your sine graph. Okay, so we're going to look at a tan graph. A tan graph, this has -1, so it's a reverse tan graph. This is your B. Remember, the period for the tan is pi divided by B, not 2 pi like the cos. This does have a phase shift. It's pi right, and it has no vertical shift. So remember, in the tan, this is not your starting point like it is for the sine and the cos. That is your center. So pi is going to become my center. And again, there is no phase or vertical shift, so that's going to be my 0 and not going up or down. I'm going to get my critical numbers by taking pi over 2 and dividing by 4. So it's pi over 2 times 1/4 if you divide by 4, which is pi over 8. So I'm going to add 1/8 to the right 2 times and then subtract 1/8 to the left. So if I add 1 plus 1/8, I get, and you can do it on your calculators, I get 1 and 1/8, which is 9/8 pi. And 9/8 pi plus 1/8 pi is 10/8 pi, which you put on your calculator, 5/4. There's one asymptote. Then I'm going to take 1 pi and subtract 1/8. So 1 pi minus 1/8 is 7/8. So I'm going to subtract 1/8. 1 minus 1/8, and you could put it on your calculator, is 7/8. And then 7/8 minus 1/8 is 6/8, which is 3/4 pi. And it's not drawn very well to scale, but those are my asymptotes. This is my center, and it's a reverse amp. So normally on to the right, tan goes up to its amp, but this is going to go down. And to the left, you usually go down, but you're going to go up. And that would be your graph. So then we tried to write equations. So we're going to write a cos equation. And what I told you all to do to get your equation is go where x is 0 and trace one cos graph. So there is one cos graph. So I can see there is no vertical shift because I'm 4 up and 4 down. But I can see my amp is 4. And I'm writing a cos graph. And then you get your period. The period is 1. So again, I'm going to go 2 pi over b equals 1 and cross multiply. 2 pi equals b. And there would be my equation. If I want to write a sine graph, again, I want you to go where x is 0 and graph one sine graph. So there's one sine graph. So again, it doesn't have a vertical shift. I can see I'm 2 up and 2 down. So my amp is 2. I have a period, if you look at that, of 4 pi. So the period is 4 pi. So 2 pi over b is equal to 4 pi. 2 pi equals 4 pi b. I'm going to divide by 4 pi. And I'm going to get b equals 1/2. And that would be my equation. If I look at a tan graph, tan is sometimes the hardest, particularly when they give you a lot of tan graphs. Find the y-axis. So your y-axis is right here. So then find the two asymptotes that are on either side of that. So there's an asymptote here, and there's an asymptote there. So that's the tan graph I'm looking at. So the first thing I know, there's no vertical shift. I would find my B number, or my amp number, sorry. So go in the middle between the y-axis and the asymptote as best you can and go up. And it looks to me like I'm approximately at 2. If you said 1, I wouldn't mark you wrong, but I really think the middle is at 2. So this is 2 tan. And then the period, this first asymptote, if this is a 1, this is at 1/2. So on the other side of the green line, that's 1/2. So your period is 1/2 plus 1/2, which is 1. So again, the period formula for the tan is pi over b equals 1, cross multiply, pi equals b. So there would be your equation. Then we went to problems in which we wrote a sine and a cos graph. So the first thing I would do is I always look to see if there's a vertical shift. And if you remember, there is a vertical shift if it doesn't center on the x-axis, and it doesn't. So I'd get my vertical shift. Again, we had a formula, max y plus min y divided by 2, which would be 1. And then I always get my amp number. My amp number, again, and you could just count it. So here's my vertical shift line. Put that line in there. You can see you're just up 1, or max y minus min y divided by 2, which is 1. So I have an amp of 1, and I know my vertical shift is plus 1. And then you have to decide, are you going to do a sine or a cos graph first? So you go to your axis, which is right here, and you're right on the axis. If you're on the axis, you're going to write a sine graph. And then you just need your B. So I go like this, and I look at that. The period is 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. This ended at 4/4 right here. This is 3/4 right there. So the period is 4/4 pi, which is 1 pi. So you're going to go 2 pi divided by b is equal to pi, cross multiply, 2 pi is equal to b pi, divide by pi, b equals 2. And we'll finish this on the